There was a boy in a noisy animal shelter, and a dog in the very last kennel that no one seemed to notice. At first, this doesn't sound unusual. Shelters are full of dogs. Most of them bark, most of them jump, most of them do everything they can to be chosen. But this boy was different. His name was Romeo, and he could not hear the barking the way everyone else could. So instead of calling out to the dogs, he used sign language. He walked from kennel to kennel, raising his hands, trying to greet them in the only language that felt natural to him. And none of them responded, so eventually Romeo gave up. He and his mother turned to leave, and that's when something strange happened. At the very end of the corridor in the last kennel they had not even reached yet, one quiet dog suddenly stood up, not barking, not jumping, just watching Romeo. Then the boy lifted his hands one more time, and the dog reacted. Now, maybe that sounds like a coincidence, but what happened next made everyone in that shelter stop and stare, because this was not a dog reacting to noise, it was reacting to the signs, and that raised a much bigger question. Why would a shelter dog understand a language almost no one had used with him in months? And what happened next, no one in that shelter expected. But before we get into it, make sure you subscribe, please, it helps me a lot. The shelter was louder than Romeo expected. The moment the front door opened, the sound hit him like a wave. Even though Romeo could not hear the barking the way others did, he could still feel it. The vibrations traveled through the floor, through the metal cages, through the air itself. Dozens of dogs were moving at once, paws scratching against kennel doors, bodies jumping up and down as strangers walked past. Romeo stepped closer to his mother instinctively. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder and smiled at him, though Romeo could tell the noise was overwhelming for her too. She had hesitated before bringing him here. The idea had come from Romeo's therapist, who believed a dog might help him feel less alone, someone who could stay beside him without needing words. Still, Romeo's mother worried. The world was already difficult enough for her son. Adding responsibility felt risky. But Romeo had insisted. He had written the request carefully on a small notepad the night before. Maybe a dog would understand me. The sentence had broken her heart a little. So here they were. Inside the shelter lobby, a volunteer greeted them with a friendly smile and began explaining how the adoption process worked. Romeo watched her lips carefully, trying to follow along the way he had practiced since he was young. Sometimes he understood. Sometimes he missed pieces and had to guess. His mother helped when she could. After a short conversation, the volunteer led them through a hallway toward the kennel area. The barking grew stronger. Rows of metal enclosures stretched down both sides of the corridor. Inside them were dogs of every size and color imaginable. Some pressed their faces against the bars, tails wagging wildly. Others jumped repeatedly at the gates, desperate for attention. A few barked non-stop, their mouths open wide as they tried to be the loudest voice in the room. Romeo walked slowly beside his mother. Every few steps he stopped and looked into another kennel. He raised his hands carefully. Romeo used sign language the way other children used speech. His movements were smooth and practiced, shaped by years of communicating through gestures rather than sound. He signed the same simple message to each dog. Hello. Some dogs barked louder. Others leaped toward him excitedly. A few barely noticed him at all. None of them responded to his signs. The shelter volunteer tried to stay encouraging. Sometimes it takes a while, she said gently. Romeo nodded politely, though the words didn't fully reach him. He continued down the corridor, stopping in front of each kennel the same way. His hands moved. His eyes searched. But the connection he hoped for never came. After nearly 15 minutes, his mother glanced toward the exit hallway. Romeo noticed. She was trying not to show it, but he understood the look on her face. She had seen that expression before when situations became difficult for him. Maybe this wasn't going to work. Maybe the shelter was simply too much. She stepped closer and signed slowly to him. Do you want to go home? Romeo looked down for a moment. The excitement he had felt earlier that morning had faded quietly into disappointment. The dogs here were energetic, loud, and full of movement. None of them seemed to notice the quiet way he tried to speak. He nodded slowly. His mother squeezed his shoulder gently. They turned to leave. But as they began walking back toward the front of the shelter, something unusual happened. At the very end of the corridor, in the last row of kennels they had not yet reached, a dog suddenly stood up. Unlike the others, this dog had not been barking. He had been lying quietly near the back of his enclosure. But now he moved quickly toward the gate. The dog wasn't jumping wildly, the way many others had been. Instead, he stretched upward, placing his front paws carefully against the metal bars, as if he was trying to get a better look at something happening down the hallway. The volunteer noticed it first. "That's strange," she said quietly. Romeo and his mother both turned. The dog was medium-sized, lean but strong, with a short golden-brown coat and alert dark eyes. He looked younger than some of the older shelter dogs, but calmer than the energetic puppies nearby. Most of the dogs were focused on the volunteer. But this one was focused on Romeo. The dog's head tilted slightly. He leaned closer to the bars, watching the boy with intense curiosity. Romeo stopped walking. His mother noticed the shift immediately. "What is it?" she asked softly. Romeo didn't answer. He slowly stepped back toward the kennel at the end of the corridor. The dog lowered himself slightly, but remained close to the gate. Unlike the others, he didn't bark. He simply watched. Romeo approached carefully. The shelter volunteer looked surprised. "That one's usually very quiet," she said. Romeo stopped a few feet away from the kennel. For a moment neither he nor the dog moved. Then Romeo raised his hands. His fingers moved gently through the familiar shapes of sign language. "Hello." The dog's ears lifted. His head tilted again, this time even further. The calm animal stepped closer to the gate. He didn't bark. He didn't jump. He simply sat down in front of Romeo and kept watching his hands. The hallway suddenly felt quieter. Not because the barking had stopped. Dozens of dogs were still jumping and scratching at their kennels further down the corridor, but because Romeo's attention had narrowed to the dog sitting calmly in front of him. The shelter volunteer and Romeo's mother both noticed the same thing. Unlike the other dogs, this one wasn't trying to demand attention. He was observing. His ears stayed forward, and his eyes followed every movement of Romeo's hands, as if the boy were showing him something important. Romeo hesitated for a moment. Then he slowly signed again. "Hello." The movement was small, careful, almost shy. The dog leaned forward slightly. His head tilted in a curious way, the kind of motion dogs sometimes made when they were trying to understand something unfamiliar. Romeo blinked. He looked back at his mother, then at the dog again. Most dogs had ignored his hands completely. This one hadn't. The volunteer stepped closer to the kennel and glanced down at the small information card clipped to the metal door. "Oh," she said softly. "What?" Romeo's mother asked. The volunteer leaned a little closer, reading the card more carefully. "This one came in about 2 months ago," she explained. "Found wandering near a construction site. No microchip, no owner ever came forward." She paused for a second. "But it also says he's extremely calm, hardly ever barks." Romeo was still standing quietly in front of the kennel. He raised his hands again. This time he signed something slightly different. "Friend." The movement was slower, more deliberate. The dog's ears lifted higher. His eyes followed Romeo's hands closely, as if he were trying to decode something important. Then the dog stood up. Romeo froze. The dog stepped closer to the kennel door, his paws moving slowly across the concrete floor until he reached the bars. Instead of jumping like the others had done earlier, he simply lowered his head and sat again directly in front of Romeo. His body relaxed. His eyes never left the boy's hands. The volunteer exchanged a surprised look with Romeo's mother. "That's unusual," she murmured. "What is?" Romeo's mother asked quietly. "He never reacts like this to people," the volunteer said. "Usually he just sits quietly when visitors pass." Romeo noticed the conversation, but didn't fully follow the words. What he understood clearly was the dog. The animal's attention felt different from the others. Most of the dogs had reacted to excitement, noise, movement, but this one reacted to stillness, to the quiet shapes Romeo's hands made in the air. Romeo slowly knelt down. Now he was closer to the dog's eye level. The dog shifted slightly, adjusting his position so he could see Romeo better through the bars. Romeo signed again. "Good dog." The dog's tail moved once, just a small sweep across the floor. Romeo felt something warm spread through his chest. He hadn't felt that feeling in a long time. Hope. Behind him, his mother watched carefully. She had come to the shelter expecting disappointment. She had seen Romeo struggle with social situations before, especially when communication became difficult. But right now something was happening she couldn't quite explain. The dog looked like he was studying Romeo. Not randomly, purposefully. The volunteer crouched beside the kennel. "His name here is Cooper," she said gently. "We had to give him something for the records." Romeo looked at the tag clipped to the kennel door. Cooper, male approx. 3 years old, found stray. 3 years. Young, but not a puppy. Cooper shifted again and placed one paw lightly against the metal bars. Romeo slowly lifted his hand toward the paw. The volunteer immediately spoke. "Wait, let me open the gate," she said. She stood up and reached for the latch. Romeo's mother hesitated slightly. "Is he safe?" she asked. The volunteer nodded. "He's one of the calmest dogs we have here." The latch clicked. The kennel door opened slowly. For a moment, no one moved. Cooper remained sitting exactly where he was, watching Romeo carefully. Romeo reached forward and gently placed his hand against the dog's paw. The dog didn't pull away. Instead, Cooper lowered his head slightly, almost like he was bowing. Romeo smiled. A real smile. The first one his mother had seen in weeks. Romeo raised his hands again. "Friend." Cooper leaned closer. Then he did something that made the volunteer gasp quietly. The dog lifted his paw and placed it gently into Romeo's open hand. Not randomly. Deliberately. As if responding. Romeo's mother covered her mouth. "Did you see that?" she whispered. The volunteer nodded slowly, staring at the dog. "Yes," she said softly. "I think I did." Romeo looked down at the paw resting in his hand. Then he looked back at Cooper. For the first time since entering the shelter, Romeo no longer felt like someone who couldn't be heard. Because this dog wasn't listening to sound. He was watching. For a few seconds after Cooper placed his paw in Romeo's hand, no one moved. The hallway was still filled with barking from the other kennels, but it felt distant now, almost like background noise. The moment happening at the last kennel had pulled everyone's attention away from the rest of the shelter. Romeo looked down at the paw, resting carefully in his palm. It wasn't heavy, but it was steady. Cooper wasn't pushing or pulling away. The dog simply held the contact, watching Romeo with calm, focused eyes. Romeo slowly lifted his gaze. Cooper's head tilted again. The movement made Romeo smile wider. Behind him, his mother took a small step forward, still watching carefully. She had expected the shelter visit to be difficult for Romeo. Usually, situations with loud environments and unfamiliar people drained him quickly. But now he looked different. Alive. Curious. Connected. The shelter volunteer crouched down beside them again, her eyes still fixed on Cooper. "That's not normal behavior for a dog meeting someone new," she said quietly. Romeo's mother glanced at her. "What do you mean?" "Most shelter dogs are either nervous or overly excited when someone approaches their kennel," the volunteer explained. "But Cooper, He's responding very specifically to Romeo. Romeo didn't hear the words clearly, but he noticed the expressions on their faces. He looked back at Cooper. Then he slowly lifted his hands again. "Friend." Cooper's ears perked immediately. The dog leaned forward, watching the movement of Romeo's fingers carefully. Then his tail wagged again. Not wildly. Just once. Romeo blinked. He signed again. "Sit." Cooper was already sitting. But something strange happened anyway. The dog straightened his posture instantly, his body adjusting slightly as if acknowledging the command. The volunteer's eyebrows lifted. "Wait," she said quietly. Romeo didn't notice her reaction. He was focused entirely on Cooper. He signed something else. "Good." Cooper lowered his head slightly and wagged his tail again. The volunteer slowly stood up. "Okay, that's strange," she said. Romeo's mother looked concerned. "What's strange?" The volunteer stepped closer to the kennel card attached to the door and read it again carefully. 3 years old, she murmured. Found stray, no previous owner listed. She looked back at Cooper, then at Romeo's hands, then back at Cooper again. "I want to check something," she said. She walked quickly down the hallway toward a small office door near the end of the corridor. Romeo and his mother remained where they were. Romeo continued sitting beside Cooper. He lifted his hands again. "Play." Cooper leaned forward slightly and nudged Romeo's arm with his nose. Romeo laughed silently, his shoulders shaking with the movement. His mother watched him closely. She hadn't seen that kind of joy on his face since before the fire that had taken so much from their lives. After a minute, the volunteer returned holding a thin folder. She opened it and flipped through several pages while glancing back and forth between the papers and the dog. "Here it is," she said softly. Romeo's mother stepped closer. "What did you find?" The volunteer turned the folder so she could read it more clearly. "Cooper wasn't completely stray," she explained. "When animal control picked him up, someone from a nearby training facility thought they recognized him." Romeo's mother frowned. "Recognized him how?" The volunteer pointed to one line in the file. "Possible former training dog." Romeo's mother blinked. "A training dog?" "Yes," the volunteer said. "It looks like he may have belonged to a private trainer who worked with service dogs and search dogs." She flipped another page. "And according to this note, the trainer sometimes used hand signals instead of verbal commands." Romeo's mother slowly turned toward her son. Romeo was kneeling on the floor beside Cooper now, both of them sitting calmly together like they had known each other much longer than 20 minutes. Romeo signed again. "Stay." Cooper didn't move. The volunteer stared at them. "That's it," she whispered. Romeo's mother felt a sudden lump form in her throat. "You're saying?" The volunteer nodded slowly. "I think this dog understands hand signals." Romeo raised his hands again. He signed something very simple. "Friend." Cooper leaned forward and rested his head gently against Romeo's shoulder. Romeo wrapped his arms around the dog's neck. And for the first time in a long time, the quiet boy who struggled to communicate with the world had found someone who understood him perfectly. But neither Romeo nor his mother knew something else yet. The folder the volunteer was holding contained one more note. A final detail about Cooper's previous trainer. A detail that would make the moment even more powerful once they discovered it. And that truth was about to change everything. Romeo remained kneeling on the shelter floor, his arms loosely wrapped around Cooper's neck. The dog stayed still in the quiet embrace, breathing calmly as if this moment felt as natural to him as it did to the boy. For the first time since entering the shelter, Romeo wasn't looking around nervously. He wasn't wondering if people understood him. Because right now, someone did. Behind him, the volunteer still held the thin folder, flipping slowly through the remaining pages. Something in the notes had caught her attention, and the longer she read, the more serious her expression became. Romeo's mother noticed. "What is it?" she asked softly. The volunteer hesitated for a moment. Then she turned the folder so Romeo's mother could see the last page. "There's more information here about where Cooper came from," she said quietly. Romeo's mother stepped closer. The page contained a small report written by the animal control officer, who had picked up the dog several months earlier. Dog found near closed training property outside town. Property belonged to former K-9 trainer Samuel Grant. Trainer passed away 6 months ago. Romeo's mother looked up slowly. "He lost his trainer?" she asked. The volunteer nodded. "That's what it looks like." She continued reading. Samuel Grant specialized in training working dogs using nonverbal commands, the volunteer explained. Apparently, he preferred hand signals because they were more precise in noisy environments. Romeo's mother glanced toward her son. Romeo was sitting cross-legged on the floor now, his hands moving slowly as he signed something else to Cooper. "Good dog." Cooper's ears lifted. His tail wagged gently. The volunteer exhaled slowly. "I think Cooper hasn't just been calm here," she said quietly. "I think he's been waiting." "For what?" Romeo's mother asked. The volunteer looked toward Romeo. "For someone who speaks the same way he does." Romeo didn't hear the conversation behind him. He was focused on Cooper. He lifted his hands again. "Come." Cooper stood immediately. Not hesitantly. Not randomly. The dog moved forward one step, exactly the way a trained animal would respond to a command. Romeo blinked in surprise. Then he smiled again. The volunteer shook her head in amazement. "That's incredible," she whispered. Romeo's mother felt tears forming in her eyes. She had spent years worrying about how difficult communication was for her son. At school, teachers struggled to keep up with him. Other children sometimes avoided conversations because they didn't know how to respond. But here, in the last kennel of a noisy shelter, her son wasn't struggling at all. He was leading. Romeo signed again. "Sit." Cooper sat. The command was instant. "Perfect." The volunteer slowly knelt beside them again. "Romeo," she said gently, trying to get his attention. He looked up. She pointed to Cooper and signed clumsily. She didn't know sign language well, but she tried. "He understands you." Romeo looked at Cooper again. Then he looked back at the volunteer. His eyes widened slightly. The volunteer smiled softly. "This dog was trained using hands, just like you," she explained, speaking slowly while also trying to repeat the shapes Romeo had used earlier. Romeo stared at Cooper for a long moment. Then he signed again. "You understand me." Cooper leaned forward and nudged Romeo's chest with his nose. Romeo laughed silently again. His shoulders shook with excitement. The volunteer stood and closed the folder. "You know," she said to Romeo's mother, "this dog has been overlooked by nearly every visitor who came through here." Romeo's mother frowned. "Why?" "Because he's quiet," the volunteer said. "Most people come to shelters expecting dogs to run toward them, bark, or act excited. Cooper doesn't do that." She gestured toward Romeo. "But he reacted immediately to your son." Romeo's mother looked down at the boy and the dog sitting calmly beside each other. The connection between them was obvious now. The volunteer folded her arms and smiled. "I think Cooper has been waiting for someone who communicates like this," she said. Romeo signed something again. "Friend." Cooper moved closer and rested his head on Romeo's knee. The volunteer exhaled softly. "Well," she said quietly, "looks like the last kennel might have been the right one after all." But the moment was about to become even more emotional. Because when Romeo's mother turned toward her son again, she noticed something she hadn't seen in a very long time. Romeo wasn't just smiling. He looked confident. For the first time since his world had grown quiet, he had found someone who listened without needing a single spoken word. And in that silent conversation between boy and dog, everyone in the shelter suddenly understood something powerful. Neither of them had been waiting by accident. The shelter hallway felt different now. The barking from the other kennels had not stopped, and the constant scratching of paws against metal doors still echoed through the building, but none of it seemed to matter anymore. Everyone standing near the last kennel was focused on the same quiet moment unfolding between Romeo and Cooper. Romeo sat on the floor with his legs crossed, his hands resting gently on the dog's shoulders. Cooper remained beside him, calm and steady, his body leaning slightly toward the boy as if he had already decided where he belonged. Romeo looked into the dog's eyes for a long moment. Then he lifted his hands again. "Stay." Cooper stayed. "Friend." Cooper's tail wagged slowly against the floor. The volunteer watched them with a soft smile, while Romeo's mother wiped the corner of her eye with her sleeve. She hadn't expected to feel this emotional inside a noisy shelter hallway. For weeks she had been worried about Romeo. Ever since the fire that had changed their lives, her son had grown quieter than ever. He already lived in a silent world because of his hearing, but the loss they had experienced had made that silence feel heavier. She had hoped a dog might help him, but she had never imagined something like this. The volunteer knelt beside Romeo again. "You know," she said gently, trying to sign the words as best she could, "Cooper has been here for almost 2 months." Romeo looked up. The volunteer pointed toward the rows of kennels behind them. "Many families came to see the dogs," she explained, "but they usually walked past Cooper." She paused. He didn't bark, he didn't jump. He just sat quietly and watched. Romeo looked down at the dog again. Cooper watched Romeo's hands carefully. The volunteer continued. "I think he was waiting for someone who speaks his language." Romeo blinked slowly. Then he signed something simple. "Me?" The volunteer nodded. "Yes, you." Romeo looked at Cooper again. For a moment he didn't move. Then he lifted his hands. "Home." Cooper's ears lifted. The dog leaned closer and rested his head gently against Romeo's shoulder. Romeo wrapped his arms around him. Behind them, the shelter worker standing near the hallway entrance shook her head quietly in amazement. "I've worked here 5 years," she said softly. "I've never seen something like that." The volunteer stood up. "Well," she said with a smile, "I think we might have found the right match." Romeo's mother stepped forward. Her voice was a little shaky. "If it's okay with the shelter, I think we would like to adopt him." The volunteer nodded immediately. "I was hoping you'd say that." She reached for the paperwork folder and began flipping through the forms. But Romeo wasn't paying attention to the paperwork. He was still focused on Cooper. He signed again. "Come." Cooper stood instantly. "Sit." Cooper sat again. Romeo laughed silently. It was the kind of laugh that made his shoulders shake and his eyes shine. His mother felt her heart tighten again as she watched him. She hadn't seen him this confident in months. Maybe longer. The volunteer finished the paperwork and handed the final sheet to Romeo's mother. "All we need now is your signature," she said. Romeo's mother signed the form slowly. When she finished, the volunteer clipped a small blue adoption tag onto Cooper's collar. "Congratulations," she said. Romeo looked at the tag. Then he looked back at Cooper. He signed one last thing. "Family." Cooper stood up and gently placed one paw into Romeo's open hand again. The same way he had done earlier. But this time it felt different. This time it wasn't curiosity. It was understanding. Romeo squeezed the paw gently. The volunteer smiled. "You know," she said quietly to Romeo's mother, "some dogs find their families right away." She looked down at Romeo and Cooper. "And some dogs wait until the right person finally walks into the last kennel." Romeo didn't hear the words. But he didn't need to. Because as he walked out of the shelter that afternoon with Cooper beside him, he knew something for certain. For the first time in his life, someone understood every word he said, even when he never made a sound.